There was always something strangely unfinished about the ending of All-Star Superman. Not emotionally unfinished, structurally unfinished. The story ends with Superman entering the sun, preserving reality through self-sacrifice, becoming less a man than a gravitational constant holding existence together. It feels complete on the surface, beautiful even, but beneath that ending sits a question the comic never fully resolves. What exactly happens to the world after a figure like Superman disappears from history? Not after his death as tragedy, after his absence as structure, because Morrison never wrote Superman as merely a superhero. Superman functions more like atmospheric pressure inside modern mythology, a stabilizing field, a moral gravity. Entire civilizations inside the DC universe unconsciously organize themselves around the assumption that somewhere above them exists an impossible being who fundamentally loves humanity. Not conditionally, not strategically, completely. The entire emotional architecture of Superman depends on that impossible premise. And that premise creates dependence. That is the hidden tension inside All-Star Superman. Clark Kent spends the entire narrative preparing humanity for separation. Every act inside the story feels less like heroic intervention and more like controlled withdrawal. Superman is not trying to save the world from destruction. He is trying to teach civilization how to psychologically survive without him. The famous moments of compassion throughout the book carry an unusual weight because they resemble farewell rituals more than triumphs. A father preparing children for a future where protection no longer exists. The comic understands something uncomfortable about power. The more benevolent the protector becomes, the more catastrophic his absence eventually feels. Which is why the ending never truly closes the symbolic equation. Because the question remains suspended over the entire narrative, like a shadow the story refuses to directly acknowledge. What emerges after the solar father disappears from the center of civilization? What kind of humanity evolves once the moral sun is gone? What kind of successor could possibly inherit a world that grew psychologically dependent on impossible mercy? And then, years earlier, hidden inside Marvel Comics, Morrison may have already answered that question. Marvel Boy does not initially resemble a Superman story at all. On the surface it appears chaotic, aggressive, unstable. The book introduces Noh Varr as a violent post-human revolutionary, descending into a corrupt civilization he neither respects nor fully understands. Unlike Clark Kent, Noh Varr does not arrive with emotional patience toward humanity. He arrives irritated, disgusted, curious but detached. He treats Earth less like a home and more like a primitive territory trapped inside obsolete systems. And yet the deeper the comic unfolds, the stranger the parallels become. Noh Varr carries the same impossible genetic promise associated with Superman, but stripped of Smallville, stripped of Kansas, stripped of restraint. He feels like a Superman raised without emotional gravity. Not evil, something more dangerous than evil. Unanchored, a future evolutionary stage disconnected from the moral architecture that once stabilized power. The resemblance becomes even more unsettling once Morrison's abandoned Superman 2000 proposal enters the equation. Inside those early conceptual plans existed the idea of Superman Secundus, a future descendant created from the DNA of Superman and Lois Lane, an evolved post-human heir designed to inherit the future once the original Superman transcended ordinary existence. Morrison never officially completed that concept inside DC continuity, but the ghost of it lingers everywhere afterward, especially inside Noh Varr, because Marvel Boy does not behave like the birth of a traditional hero. It behaves like the arrival of a successor civilization. The comic constantly frames him as an intrusion from a future humanity that has surpassed modern emotional frameworks entirely. He is beautiful, narcissistic, hyper-violent, sexually fluid, technologically organic, psychologically detached from national identity, detached from capitalism, detached even from conventional heroism itself. He does not protect systems. He destabilizes them. Every room he enters begins to psychologically collapse under the pressure of his existence. Clark Kent represented the fantasy that absolute power could remain emotionally human. Noh Varr represents the possibility that evolution eventually abandons that illusion altogether. And suddenly the entire symbolic architecture changes. Marvel Boy starts to resemble the world after Superman. Not literally, structurally, psychologically, mythologically. The comic feels like a civilization attempting to function after losing the moral center that once organized reality around itself. The bright solar stability of Superman collapses into fragmented acceleration. Consumerism mutates into biological infection. Technology loses distinction from flesh. Corporations become planetary organisms. Violence stops presenting itself as tragedy and starts behaving like adaptation. That transformation becomes impossible to ignore once Dr. Midas enters the frame. Midas does not simply resemble Lex Luthor superficially. He resembles what Lex becomes after finally winning history itself. Not a criminal mastermind anymore. Not even a billionaire industrialist. He evolves into pure economic appetite detached from humanity altogether. A man so completely fused with accumulation that he no longer experiences civilization as society. Only consumption, only extraction, only expansion. If Superman represented moral gravity, then Midas represents gravity after moral collapse. Capital without restraint, intelligence without affection, empire without species loyalty, and surrounding all of this sits Hexus, one of the most disturbing symbolic entities Morrison ever created. Hexus is not merely a villain. Hexus behaves like environmental inevitability, a living corporation, a sentient contamination spreading through media, infrastructure, desire, and biological existence simultaneously. It does not conquer territory conventionally. It absorbs symbolic space itself. Language becomes infected around it. Identity becomes unstable around it. Human beings stop behaving like citizens and start behaving like extensions of a self-replicating system. The terrifying thing about Hexus is not that it destroys humanity. It functions perfectly without humanity mattering at all, which suddenly reframes everything Morrison had been orbiting for years. Because if Superman once acted as a stabilizing symbolic sun around which civilization organized itself, then Marvel Boy imagines the psychological ecosystem that emerges once that sun disappears. The center cannot hold. Not because evil triumphs over good, because acceleration replaces morality entirely. And that may be the real secret buried beneath these stories. All-Star Superman was never just about the death of Superman. It was about the unbearable anxiety of succession, about whether humanity could survive the disappearance of paternal moral authority without mutating into something unrecognizable afterward. Marvel Boy may contain Morrison's real answer, and the answer is not hopeful. To understand why Marvel Boy feels so unnervingly connected to All-Star Superman, it becomes necessary to first understand what Morrison believed Superman actually represented beneath the surface level of Cape mythology. Not strength, not optimism, not even heroism in the conventional sense. Superman functions as a symbolic resolution to modernity's deepest psychological fracture. He is the fantasy that power and morality can permanently coexist without corruption, a king without tyranny, a god without resentment, a father whose authority never becomes domination. That fantasy matters more than people realize, because modern superhero universes are not merely collections of characters. They are moral ecosystems organized around invisible centers of gravity. Gotham functions differently because Batman exists inside it. Metropolis functions differently because Superman exists above it. Entire populations unconsciously orient themselves around those figures, even when the stories themselves pretend otherwise. The heroes become atmospheric conditions. Their existence reshapes what civilization believes is possible, and Superman occupies a uniquely dangerous position inside that ecosystem because he removes anxiety from the structure itself. His presence reassures reality. No matter how catastrophic the crisis becomes, somewhere above the city exists a being who fundamentally refuses nihilism. A being whose morality remains intact despite possessing the power to rule the planet effortlessly. Superman is not merely a protector. He is proof that unlimited power does not inevitably produce psychological collapse. That idea stabilized the 20th century imagination more deeply than comic readers often recognize. Especially after the 20th century itself became defined by industrial slaughter, ideological extremism, technological escalation, and systems increasingly detached from human scale. Superman emerged during a period when modern civilization desperately needed symbolic reassurance that progress would not inevitably consume humanity whole. He becomes a kind of solar counterweight against the growing suspicion that intelligence, industry, and empire naturally drift toward dehumanization. But Morrison's work repeatedly reveals discomfort with the hidden consequence of that fantasy. Dependency. The brighter Superman becomes, the more fragile humanity appears around him. That tension sits underneath nearly every major Morrison Superman text, but nowhere more clearly than in the abandoned concepts orbiting Superman 2000. Morrison was not interested in preserving Superman as static iconography. He wanted Superman to evolve historically, culturally, psychologically. The proposals constantly pushed toward the same question. What happens when humanity finally catches up to Superman? Or worse, what happens when humanity attempts to replace him? That is where Superman Secundus begins to matter. The concept itself feels deceptively simple at first glance. A future heir, a descendant, a new stage of the Superman lineage born from the genetic union between Clark Kent and Lois Lane. But symbolically, the idea carries enormous implications. Superman Secundus is not merely another hero inheriting a mantle. He represents the possibility that the Superman archetype eventually mutates beyond Clark himself. The son becomes not continuation, but transformation. And transformation always introduces instability, because Clark Kent's morality does not emerge solely from Kryptonian biology. It emerges from emotional architecture. Kansas, restraint, loneliness, the careful shaping pressure of human vulnerability. Superman's power becomes morally stable because it was emotionally domesticated before it fully manifested. His strength develops inside limitation, inside community, inside affection. Superman Secundus threatens that balance immediately. The moment Superman becomes reproducible, transferable, inheritable, the symbolic structure changes entirely. The archetype leaves mythology and enters evolution. And evolution does not preserve morality automatically. Evolution preserves adaptation. That distinction quietly haunts Morrison's later work, especially once Marvel Boy appears. Noh Varr enters Marvel continuity, carrying almost none of Superman's emotional stabilizers. He arrives from an alternate Kree civilization so advanced that conventional humanity barely registers to him as culturally significant. His technology fuses biology, narcotics, media, weaponry, sexuality, and identity into one seamless system. Nothing remains compartmentalized anymore. Every boundary modern civilization depends upon has already dissolved inside his world. And psychologically, that changes everything. Clark Kent constantly performs emotional containment. Noh Varr barely believes containment matters. Superman protects civilization because he sees intrinsic value inside ordinary humanity. Noh Varr evaluates humanity almost anthropologically, with intermittent fascination and intermittent contempt. He can admire beauty inside the species while simultaneously viewing its systems as primitive debris awaiting collapse. That emotional distance becomes central to Morrison's larger symbolic transition. Because Noh Varr does not behave like the continuation of 20th century heroism. He behaves like the arrival of 21st century post-humanity. Fast, hyperstimulated, narcissistic, media-saturated, morally fragmented, revolutionary without stable ideological foundation. He is less interested in preserving civilization than overwhelming it psychologically until something new emerges afterward, which suddenly makes him feel eerily close to what Superman Secundus would actually become in practice. Not Clark Kent reborn, Clark Kent surpassed. The visual language surrounding Noh Varr reinforces this sensation constantly. Morrison and J.G. Jones frame him less like a grounded human being and more like a living cultural intrusion. His body appears too perfect, too detached from biological vulnerability. His speech patterns fluctuate between adolescent irony and frightening detachment. He behaves like someone who inherited infinite possibility before inheriting emotional maturity. And that combination mirrors the hidden fear embedded inside every Superman succession narrative. What if the next Superman no longer needs humanity emotionally? That possibility reorganizes the entire symbolic landscape. Because the original Superman mythology depends on asymmetrical affection. Humanity needs Superman more than Superman needs humanity. Yet Clark continues loving humanity anyway. That is the miracle. That is the stabilizing fantasy. But once that affection disappears, the power imbalance becomes terrifying. The superior being no longer functions as protector. He becomes observer, or curator, or invader. Noh Varr constantly hovers near all three. Even his violence feels psychologically different from Superman's restraint-based interventions. When Clark uses force, the narrative frames it as reluctant necessity. When Noh Varr uses force, it feels expressive, exploratory, almost aesthetic. Violence becomes part of his identity performance, a declaration that older moral structures no longer possess authority over him. That shift reflects broader cultural anxieties emerging around the turn of the millennium. 20th century superheroes largely operated through paternal frameworks. Moral certainty descended from stable authority figures. Heroes functioned as guardians maintaining social continuity against destabilizing threats. But the late 90s and early 2000s increasingly distrusted paternal systems altogether. Governments, corporations, media institutions, even traditional masculinity itself began appearing compromised, artificial, performative. The heroic center started collapsing. And Morrison understood that collapse earlier than most mainstream superhero writers. That is why Marvel Boy feels so culturally disorienting even now. The comic does not present post-humanity as noble transcendence. It presents post-humanity as acceleration without emotional grounding. Everything inside the story moves too fast, consumes too aggressively, mutates too rapidly. Civilization itself begins resembling a nervous system overloaded by its own technological expansion. No character embodies that mutation more completely than Dr. Midas. On the surface, Midas resembles the exaggerated corporate villainy common to comics of that era. Billionaire industrialist, megalomaniacal capitalist, obscene wealth accumulation. But Morrison frames him with almost mythological hostility. Midas does not simply exploit systems. He metabolizes reality itself into ownership. Human beings cease appearing to him as subjects with interiority. They become resources, inputs, expandable infrastructure, which is precisely what makes him resemble the final form of Lex Luthor. Not the jealous rival obsessed with Superman personally. That version of Luthor still possesses emotional attachment. Midas represents something colder. A capitalism so fully evolved that it no longer requires human justification whatsoever. His empire feels post-national, post-ethical, almost post-biological. He exists less like a man than a gravitational center pulling civilization toward total commodification. And importantly, he emerges inside a world where Superman does not exist. That absence matters psychologically. Without Superman functioning as moral counterweight, intelligence drifts toward extraction. Power drifts toward accumulation. Systems drift toward self-replication detached from human flourishing. Morrison repeatedly suggests that modern civilization naturally accelerates toward dehumanization unless actively restrained by symbolic moral gravity, which finally brings the analysis toward Hexus, perhaps the most revealing creation in the entire comic. Hexus operates less like a supervillain and more like an ecological condition, a corporate consciousness spreading through media infrastructure, biological systems, architecture, language, and desire simultaneously. The entity possesses no stable body because it no longer needs one. It survives through circulation itself, through replication, through saturation, and that makes Hexus horrifying in ways older comic villains never fully were. Traditional villains still sought control over civilization. Hexus barely distinguishes itself from civilization anymore. That distinction becomes the key to understanding Morrison's larger symbolic progression from Superman toward Marvel Boy. The threat is no longer external invasion, no longer evil empire versus heroic protector. The threat becomes systemic absorption, humanity dissolving inside networks too vast, too accelerated, too psychologically invasive for traditional heroism to contain. Which is precisely why Noh Varr feels simultaneously necessary and terrifying. He is one of the only beings capable of surviving this environment because he already evolved inside similar conditions elsewhere. But survival comes at a cost. He possesses adaptation without emotional continuity, power without paternal obligation, vision without restraint, and suddenly the hidden structure connecting these stories becomes impossible to ignore. All-Star Superman imagines the graceful withdrawal of the solar father from civilization. Marvel Boy imagines the unstable evolutionary vacuum that emerges afterward, not the continuation of Superman, the mutation produced by his absence. The first major transformation inside Marvel Boy occurs the moment the story stops treating Noh Varr as a superhero and begins treating him as an evolutionary event. That distinction changes the emotional temperature of the entire narrative. Superheroes traditionally stabilize fictional worlds. Even rebellious heroes ultimately preserve the continuity around them. They may challenge corrupt authority, but they rarely destabilize the symbolic architecture of civilization itself. Noh Varr does. Every scene surrounding him carries the sensation that ordinary humanity has already become historically obsolete, even if civilization itself has not yet realized it. Morrison frames Earth less like a functioning society and more like an aging empire continuing through inertia after the collapse of its founding myth. Governments remain operational. Media continues broadcasting. Consumer culture still saturates every visible surface. Yet beneath that continuity sits a growing psychic exhaustion, as though the world already senses its own spiritual redundancy. This is where the hidden connection to Superman becomes psychologically unavoidable, because Superman historically functioned as the myth preventing that exhaustion from fully surfacing. He represented continuity between power and moral legitimacy. As long as Superman existed, civilization could still imagine itself as fundamentally redeemable. His presence projected symbolic reassurance outward into the collective imagination. The world remained worth saving because Superman himself believed it was worth saving. Noh Varr never fully grants humanity that reassurance, and Morrison emphasizes this repeatedly through spatial framing. Superman traditionally occupies vertical symbolic space. Sky, sunlight, open horizons. Metropolis appears expansive beneath him, because his existence creates psychological elevation around the world itself. Noh Varr, by contrast, constantly moves through enclosed environments saturated by technological claustrophobia. Apartments, nightclubs, corporate laboratories, media screens, narcotic haze. His world feels compressed inward by overstimulation. The difference matters. Clark Kent descends toward humanity emotionally. Noh Varr observes humanity laterally, almost clinically, as though evaluating a civilization trapped inside developmental arrest. Even moments of intimacy carry emotional asymmetry. Human beings become objects of fascination, irritation, desire, or temporary loyalty, but rarely equals. Morrison subtly removes the democratic emotional foundation underlying traditional superhero fiction. That removal transforms the meaning of violence immediately. Superman's restraint always reinforced human dignity. He limits himself because humanity matters intrinsically. His self-control reassures the audience that overwhelming power can coexist with reverence for vulnerability. But Noh Varr's violence carries no such reassurance. When he kills, the narrative does not frame the act as tragic deviation from ideal morality. It feels adaptive, functional, sometimes even inevitable. This is not simply cynicism. It reflects a deeper symbolic shift occurring across popular culture at the beginning of the 21st century. The old heroic framework depended on paternal ethics. Heroes embodied stable moral authority capable of containing social chaos from above. But by the late 90s, that paternal architecture had begun collapsing culturally. Institutions no longer inspired trust. Governments increasingly resembled theatrical management systems disconnected from ordinary human life. Corporations expanded beyond national identity. Media environments accelerated faster than human psychological processing could comfortably absorb. The collective imagination started losing faith in guardians. And when cultures lose faith in guardians, they begin fantasizing about survivors instead. Noh Varr belongs to that second category entirely. He is not designed psychologically to protect civilization. He is designed to endure post-civilization conditions. Morrison constantly signals this through his biology and technology. His body no longer distinguishes cleanly between organism and weapon. His nervous system interfaces seamlessly with narcotic systems, information systems, military systems, and media systems simultaneously. He embodies adaptation through total integration with acceleration itself, which makes him feel less like Superman's successor and more like Superman's replacement after moral evolution fails. That distinction becomes central once the narrative fully introduces Dr. Midas into the symbolic ecosystem. Midas initially appears almost absurd in scale, a grotesque accumulation of wealth, narcissism, appetite, and technological excess. Yet Morrison carefully avoids presenting him as merely individual corruption. Midas behaves like the logical conclusion of civilization organized entirely around extraction. He is not psychologically interested in human flourishing because the systems producing his power no longer require flourishing populations to sustain themselves. Humanity exists primarily as fuel. This is precisely where the comic begins mirroring the unresolved tension buried inside Lex Luthor. Traditional interpretations of Luthor still frame him through rivalry, envy, ego, intellectual resentment towards Superman's symbolic dominance. But those motivations still imply emotional investment in humanity itself. Luthor wants recognition from civilization. He still requires the human stage psychologically. Midas barely requires the stage anymore. His empire feels post-human already. Corporate infrastructure spreads around him like artificial ecology, absorbing every available symbolic territory into itself. Technology ceases functioning as tool and begins functioning as environment. The city itself no longer appears inhabited so much as metabolized by economic systems operating beyond human scale. And without Superman's symbolic gravity restraining that expansion, the process accelerates uncontrollably. That is the true horror emerging beneath the comic's surface. Morrison is not simply imagining a world without Superman physically present. He is imagining a civilization no longer psychologically shaped by Superman's values at all. The absence becomes atmospheric. Ethical gravity weakens. Humanity continues moving technologically forward while emotionally fragmenting underneath the pressure, which explains why every major structure inside Marvel Boy feels unstable. Identity becomes unstable. National identity dissolves. Sexual identity fluctuates fluidly. Biological identity mutates through technology. Media identity overwhelms interiority. Nothing remains fixed long enough to sustain continuity. The comic presents civilization itself as entering a phase transition where old symbolic anchors no longer possess stabilizing authority. And this is where Morrison's treatment of youth becomes especially important. Noh Varr is not merely younger than Superman. He embodies an entirely different relationship to history. Superman carries the emotional weight of inherited ideals. He protects civilization partly because he believes civilization contains unrealized moral potential worth preserving. Noh Varr behaves like someone born after faith in historical continuity already collapsed. His generation does not inherit institutions as sacred structures. It inherits systems already experienced as compromised simulations. That psychological difference explains why Noh Varr oscillates constantly between revolutionary idealism and detached narcissism. He genuinely despises corruption. He genuinely wants transformation. But he possesses almost no emotional loyalty toward existing humanity as collective identity. Civilization appears to him less like community than malfunctioning infrastructure awaiting replacement. And Morrison refuses to soften that tension. The comic repeatedly forces the audience into uncomfortable proximity with a possibility superhero fiction traditionally avoids acknowledging. What if superior beings eventually stop perceiving humanity sentimentally? What if emotional attachment itself becomes evolutionarily inefficient? What if the next stage of intelligence no longer experiences moral restraint as virtue, but as developmental limitation? That anxiety silently shadows every interaction in the story, especially because Noh Varr still retains fragments of recognizable humanity. He feels attraction, curiosity, loyalty, grief. But those emotions no longer organize his identity structurally. They appear intermittent, situational. His center of gravity exists elsewhere, inside a post-human framework ordinary civilization cannot fully comprehend, which gradually transforms him from protagonist into symbolic pressure system. Every environment around him starts revealing hidden fractures already present beneath the surface. Police structures reveal authoritarian impulses instantly. Corporate systems reveal predatory logic instantly. Media systems reveal voyeuristic appetite instantly. Noh Varr does not create the corruption surrounding him. He accelerates its visibility. That acceleration becomes the defining rhythm of the narrative. And nowhere is it more visible than in the emergence of Hexus. Because Hexus finally externalizes the condition haunting the entire comic from the beginning. A civilization consumed by systems that no longer distinguish between economic expansion and biological invasion. Hexus spreads through contamination, replication, saturation. Not conquest in the classical sense. It does not overthrow humanity militarily. It absorbs humanity metabolically, which is precisely why traditional heroism cannot meaningfully oppose it. Superman could defeat invasions because invasions still respected boundaries. Hexus dissolves boundaries themselves. It infects language, infrastructure, consumption, desire, visibility. The entity behaves like late-stage capitalism transformed into ecological inevitability. a system so deeply integrated into civilization that resistance begins resembling self-destruction. And suddenly Morrison's hidden progression becomes horrifyingly clear. All-Star Superman asked whether humanity could survive emotionally after the disappearance of its symbolic father. Marvel Boy begins answering that question by presenting a civilization already mutating under the absence. Not collapsing immediately, transforming into something faster, colder, more adaptive, and far less certain that humanity deserves saving at all. The second transformation inside Marvel Boy occurs when the narrative fully abandons the possibility that civilization can return to equilibrium. At first, the comic still carries traces of traditional superhero structure. A powerful outsider arrives. Corrupt forces emerge. Violent confrontations escalate. The audience instinctively searches for familiar moral geometry beneath the chaos. Some stabilizing center. Some ethical architecture capable of reorganizing disorder back into coherence. But Morrison gradually reveals that coherence itself has become obsolete. This is where the comic stops resembling superhero fiction and begins resembling civilizational mutation. The most unsettling aspect of Noh Varr is not his power. Superhero fiction has always contained powerful beings. What destabilizes the symbolic ecosystem around him is his inability to emotionally inhabit the older heroic contract. Superman's existence depends on asymmetrical responsibility. The powerful must protect the vulnerable because power without protection becomes monstrosity. That moral assumption anchors nearly every major 20th century superhero mythology. Noh Varr does not entirely reject that framework. He simply no longer experiences it as absolute, and that subtle distinction changes everything. There are moments throughout the comic where Noh Varr expresses genuine empathy toward individuals. He can be compassionate, tender even. Morrison intentionally preserves fragments of emotional accessibility inside him, because complete emotional detachment would make him easy to categorize as villain. But Noh Varr's deeper orientation never fully returns to collective humanity itself. He evaluates people individually while remaining fundamentally unconvinced by civilization as a whole. That psychological separation becomes increasingly visible as the narrative escalates. The more Earth's institutions reveal themselves, the less Noh Varr perceives humanity as morally coherent enough to justify preservation on traditional terms. Governments behave reactively. Media behaves parasitically. Corporate systems behave predation ally. Military structures operate through fear and territorial aggression. Morrison presents civilization less as democratic order and more as fragmented systems competing for symbolic dominance inside an overstimulated information landscape. This matters because Superman's morality relied upon faith that humanity remained fundamentally redeemable beneath its failures. Noh Varr increasingly appears unconvinced, and that emotional uncertainty allows Morrison to explore something superhero fiction usually avoids entirely. The possibility that superior intelligence may eventually stop recognizing human moral systems as legitimate organizing structures. This is where the comic's relationship to All-Star Superman becomes deeply disturbing. Because Clark Kent spends his final narrative teaching humanity how to inherit moral responsibility after his departure. The emotional foundation of the story depends on succession through inspiration. Superman believes humanity can evolve upward toward his ideals voluntarily. His disappearance becomes meaningful because he trusts civilization to internalize the ethical gravity he embodied externally. But Marvel Boy quietly imagines a different outcome. What if humanity internalizes only acceleration? What if technological evolution advances faster than moral integration? What if civilization absorbs Superman's scale without absorbing Superman's compassion? Noh Varr begins to resemble the answer to that imbalance. His existence constantly collapses distinctions older superhero narratives depended upon psychologically. Masculinity and femininity blur around him. Biological and technological boundaries dissolve. Consumer culture merges seamlessly with warfare. Identity itself becomes modular. Morrison frames the future not as stable progress, but as endless symbolic recombination under conditions of permanent overstimulation. And importantly, Noh Varr thrives inside that instability. Clark Kent humanized power through emotional simplicity. Noh Varr weaponizes complexity instinctively. His consciousness already evolved inside environments where media saturation, pharmacology, violence, sexuality, and politics fused into one continuous field. He does not seek stable identity because stability itself appears historically obsolete from his perspective. That is why the comic feels so prophetically uncomfortable in retrospect. The narrative anticipates a cultural atmosphere where people increasingly experience themselves less as continuous identities and more as fluctuating performances shaped by networks, platforms, aesthetics, algorithms, and symbolic affiliation. Noh Varr embodies a consciousness adapted to informational overload long before mainstream culture fully understood what such overload would psychologically produce. And surrounding him, civilization begins revealing symptoms of collapse disguised as progress. This is where Dr. Midas evolves beyond simple antagonist and becomes environmental force. Midas represents capitalism after transcending even the illusion of social contract. Earlier industrial empires still required symbolic justification, nation building, public legitimacy, cultural cohesion. Even exploitative systems historically needed populations emotionally invested in the continuation of civilization itself. Midas barely requires civilization emotionally at all. His empire spreads through pure extraction logic detached from human scale. Morrison repeatedly frames him in grotesque terms because the character symbolizes appetite without symbolic restraint. Wealth ceases functioning as economic instrument and becomes ontological expansion. Midas consumes because accumulation itself has become his identity structure. This is precisely what separates him from older versions of Lex Luthor. Luthor still needed Superman psychologically. His rivalry depended upon recognition. Midas does not seek recognition from humanity because humanity no longer exists at his level of symbolic concern. Ordinary people resemble biological residue surrounding larger systems of circulation and expansion, which is why Hexus feels less like Midas's creation than his natural ecosystem. Hexus externalizes the logic already consuming the world around it. The entity spreads through replication rather than conquest because modern systems no longer require direct domination to achieve control. Consumption itself becomes colonization. Visibility becomes infection. Desire becomes infrastructure. And Morrison frames this process with extraordinary hostility. The comic repeatedly suggests that once civilization loses coherent moral gravity, every system begins expanding according to its own internal appetite without regard for collective psychological survival. Media amplifies outrage because outrage sustains circulation. Corporations amplify consumption because consumption sustains expansion. Governments amplify fear because fear sustains control. Every institution accelerates toward its own preservation, while the collective symbolic center dissolves underneath them. Superman once interrupted that fragmentation symbolically. His existence unified the moral imagination. Even enemies oriented themselves around him. Heroes coordinated through him. Cities stabilized beneath him. He functioned less like an individual and more like an emotional axis, organizing the fictional universe around shared ethical assumptions. But in Marvel Boy, no such axis remains, which explains why the comic constantly feels psychologically anxious even during moments of triumph. Noh Varr may defeat enemies temporarily, but victory never restores order because order itself has become conceptually unstable. The world cannot return to older heroic equilibrium because the symbolic conditions producing that equilibrium already disappeared historically. And Morrison understands the audience feels this instinctively. That instinct becomes especially visible in the comic's treatment of violence as spectacle. Traditional superhero narratives frame violence through containment. Battles occur, destruction emerges, restoration follows. But Marvel Boy presents violence as media event inseparable from entertainment systems themselves. Destruction circulates aesthetically. Trauma becomes spectacle. Human suffering dissolves into acceleration. The audience inside the comic consumes catastrophe almost identically to the audience outside it, which may be Morrison's most uncomfortable insight of all, because the transition from Superman toward Noh Varr mirrors a broader cultural transition occurring in real time. 20th century mythology still imagined heroes as stabilizing fathers guiding civilization toward ethical maturity. 21st century culture increasingly produces figures optimized for visibility, disruption, adaptability, and symbolic saturation instead. Noh Varr belongs perfectly to that new environment. He is charismatic without emotional accessibility, morally reactive without moral consistency, revolutionary without stable ideology, deeply empathetic in isolated moments while remaining fundamentally detached from collective humanity as permanent identity. In other words, he behaves like a post-Superman civilization attempting to generate new myths after losing faith in the old paternal center. And Morrison refuses to reassure the audience that this transition produces moral progress. If anything, the comic increasingly suggests the opposite. Because once moral gravity collapses, acceleration itself becomes civilization's dominant organizing principle. Systems expand because they can. Violence escalates because attention rewards escalation. Technology mutates faster than psychological adaptation. Human beings drift toward identities shaped less by continuity than by amplification. Which is why Noh Varr begins to feel simultaneously necessary and catastrophic. He can survive the world emerging around him precisely because he no longer depends on the emotional assumptions that once stabilized superhero morality. But survival inside that environment requires surrendering something Superman considered sacred. Faith in humanity before humanity earns it. And once that faith disappears, the future stops looking heroic. It starts looking evolutionary. The final transformation inside Marvel Boy occurs when the comic fully reveals that the conflict was never really between heroes and villains at all. That framework collapses gradually throughout the narrative until only competing evolutionary pressures remain. Once that shift becomes visible, the entire symbolic relationship between the comic and All-Star Superman reorganizes itself retroactively. Because the real question hidden beneath both stories is no longer whether humanity deserves saving. The question becomes whether humanity remains psychologically compatible with the future it is creating. And Morrison's answer grows increasingly bleak. This is where Hexus finally becomes the central symbolic force of the narrative. Not because Hexus is the strongest entity inside the comic, but because Hexus reveals the true shape of the world emerging underneath every other conflict. The entity does not operate according to older models of evil. It possesses no coherent ideology, no wounded ego, no desire for conquest in the classical sense. Hexus spreads because expansion itself has become autonomous. That distinction matters enormously. Traditional comic villains still emerged from recognizable human drives. Revenge, envy, power hunger, fear. Their psychology remained legible because they still operated within human symbolic frameworks. Hexus barely recognizes humanity as meaningful category. It behaves more like a self-perpetuating system reaching ecological maturity. And Morrison presents modern civilization as already drifting toward that condition long before Hexus physically appears. Advertising saturates emotional life. Media environments colonize attention itself. Consumption restructures identity formation. Corporate systems grow so large they cease resembling human organizations and begin resembling planetary organisms with populations functioning as interchangeable cellular material. The city no longer feels inhabited. It feels processed. That is the true horror buried inside the comic. Humanity is not being conquered from outside. Humanity is dissolving into structures it created, but can no longer psychologically contain, which suddenly reframes Superman's entire symbolic function historically. Superman did not merely fight villains. He interrupted entropy. His presence slowed fragmentation. He imposed emotional coherence onto civilizations increasingly overwhelmed by acceleration, spectacle, and systemic abstraction. Clark Kent represented the fantasy that immense power could remain emotionally intimate enough to preserve human scale. Noh Varr does not preserve human scale. He transcends it instinctively. And the more the narrative unfolds, the more Morrison emphasizes that transcendence itself may be incompatible with older forms of morality. Noh Varr continues demonstrating isolated moments of empathy, loyalty, and tenderness throughout the comic, but those qualities no longer operate as governing principles. They appear situational rather than foundational. His deeper orientation remains adaptive rather than ethical. That difference crystallizes the entire symbolic progression Morrison seems to be tracing across these works. Superman embodied moral transcendence over power. Noh Varr embodies evolutionary transcendence beyond morality itself. And once that possibility enters the narrative fully, every remaining structure begins collapsing under its implications. This is why the comic increasingly frames institutions not as stabilizing systems, but as exhausted shells attempting to maintain authority after losing symbolic legitimacy. Governments react mechanically. Military structures escalate compulsively. Media systems amplify chaos because chaos sustains visibility. No institution appears capable of producing genuine coherence anymore, because coherence itself depended upon assumptions civilization no longer emotionally believes. Faith in shared truth. Faith in moral authority. Faith in progress as collective uplift rather than competitive acceleration. The disappearance of Superman symbolizes the collapse of those assumptions. Not literally inside continuity, psychologically inside culture. And Noh Varr emerges precisely at the moment when 20th century optimism finally begins mutating into 21st century instability. Morrison understands that transition at a level deeper than most superhero narratives are willing to acknowledge. The future no longer imagines itself as orderly advancement guided by benevolent paternal structures. The future begins imagining itself as permanent adaptation under conditions of symbolic overload, which explains why Noh Varr feels so uncannily modern even decades later. He behaves like a consciousness formed entirely after the collapse of stable collective identity. Nationhood barely matters to him. Traditional masculinity barely matters to him. Historical continuity barely matters to him. He navigates identity itself fluidly, aesthetically, strategically. He exists less like a stable personhood and more like a mobile interface between systems. And Morrison refuses to portray that condition as either purely liberating or purely tragic. That ambiguity becomes the defining emotional atmosphere of the comic. Because Noh Varr genuinely represents evolutionary advancement in many ways. He is more intellectually open than the civilization surrounding him, less psychologically repressed, less bound by obsolete tribal categories, more capable of perceiving systems structurally rather than sentimentally. He carries traces of a post-scarcity consciousness moving beyond many of humanity's inherited limitations. But simultaneously, he lacks the emotional gravity that once made Superman trustworthy. And that absence destabilizes everything, Because Superman's moral authority emerged precisely from his willingness to emotionally bind himself to ordinary humanity despite possessing every reason to transcend it. Clark Kent chooses attachment continually. He chooses limitation. He chooses patience. His greatness comes not from superiority, but from voluntary solidarity with vulnerable existence. Noh Varr rarely chooses solidarity. He chooses movement. That distinction reveals Morrison's deepest anxiety about the future of heroism itself. What if the next stage of human evolution no longer produces protectors? What if it produces accelerators instead? Figures capable of surviving increasingly unstable systems without possessing any corresponding desire to preserve ordinary humanity emotionally. Figures adapted perfectly to the informational, technological, psychological, and biological fragmentation overtaking civilization precisely because fragmentation no longer frightens them. Noh Varr thrives inside conditions Superman would instinctively try to heal. And this is where Dr. Midas reaches his full symbolic importance. Midas ultimately represents the endpoint of civilization without moral gravity. Not simply greed, not corruption, something much larger. A world where every structure reorganizes itself around expansion detached from human flourishing entirely. Wealth ceases functioning as instrument and becomes metaphysical appetite. The corporation stops serving civilization, and civilization begins serving corporate metabolism instead. Hexus merely externalizes that logic biologically. Together, Midas and Hexus reveal the future waiting beyond Superman's disappearance. Not apocalypse in the classical sense. Something colder. Systems continuing indefinitely after losing emotional connection to the human beings trapped inside them. Civilization surviving structurally while hollowing psychologically. And Morrison frames Noh Varr as both symptom and solution simultaneously. That is what makes the comic so difficult to emotionally categorize. Noh Varr opposes Midas and Hexus genuinely. He recognizes the monstrosity of the systems consuming Earth. But he opposes them as rival evolutionary force, not as moral savior restoring humanistic equilibrium. He never fully becomes Superman because the world surrounding him no longer permits Superman's emotional framework to function naturally. The Solar Father is gone, and the civilization emerging afterward no longer believes innocence can survive power intact. That realization transforms the hidden relationship between these stories into something almost tragic. All-Star Superman becomes the final expression of 20th century mythological optimism, the belief that immense power could remain emotionally compassionate forever. The belief that civilization could mature ethically under benevolent guidance. The belief that progress and humanity could evolve together harmoniously. Marvel Boy becomes the aftermath of losing faith in those beliefs. Not cynicism exactly. Disillusioned acceleration. The comic imagines a future where humanity continues evolving technologically, culturally, sexually, psychologically, but without stable moral center organizing that transformation collectively. Everything expands outward simultaneously. Identity fragments. Systems metastasize. Media consumes reality itself. Violence aestheticizes. Institutions hollow. Heroism mutates into adaptability. And standing at the center of that storm is Noh Varr, not as Superman reborn, as the being that emerges once Superman's emotional architecture can no longer survive the historical conditions surrounding it, which may be Morrison's most dangerous idea of all, that the future would not reject Superman because humanity stopped admiring him. The future would reject Superman because humanity itself was becoming psychologically incompatible with the kind of love Superman represented. What makes Marvel Boy feel so strangely prophetic is not simply its aesthetic experimentation or its post-human imagery. Superhero comics had already flirted with futurism, cybernetics, media paranoia, and moral ambiguity long before Morrison arrived. The deeper reason the comic continues feeling psychologically contemporary is that it identified a structural transformation occurring beneath popular culture itself. A transformation in how audiences related to heroes, authority, identity, and symbolic power at the beginning of the 21st century. The comic sensed that the emotional conditions capable of producing Superman were beginning to disappear. That shift matters historically because superheroes have always reflected the psychological architecture of the societies imagining them. Superman emerged during industrial modernity, when institutions still possessed symbolic legitimacy strong enough to support paternal mythology. Governments appeared stable. Progress still carried utopian potential. Technology still resembled collective advancement rather than fragmentation. Even amid wars and systemic violence, 20th century culture largely maintained faith that civilization could theoretically organize itself toward shared moral horizons. Superman embodied that confidence perfectly. He represented power integrated into coherent ethical identity. His strength never fragmented him psychologically because the surrounding culture still believed stable moral selfhood remained achievable. Clark Kent could simultaneously embody humility, responsibility, restraint, compassion, and immense authority without the audience experiencing contradiction. The symbolic ecosystem supporting Superman still trusted continuity itself. By the time Marvel Boy arrived, that continuity had already begun dissolving culturally, and Morrison understood this before mainstream superhero storytelling fully adapted to it. The comic emerges during a moment when media environments were mutating rapidly enough to destabilize collective identity formation itself. The internet accelerated symbolic circulation beyond traditional institutional control. Consumer culture increasingly replaced older forms of civic identity. Corporations expanded beyond national frameworks into transnational systems operating according to extraction logic detached from local community structures. Celebrity culture intensified visibility into permanent performance. Youth culture became increasingly fragmented into fluid aesthetic affiliations rather than stable ideological blocks. Everything started becoming simultaneous. That psychological condition saturates Marvel Boy completely. The comic does not merely depict media saturation aesthetically. It structurally behaves like a consciousness overwhelmed by acceleration. Images collide violently. Identity categories blur constantly. Emotional states fluctuate rapidly between irony, sincerity, violence, intimacy, spectacle, and detachment. Morrison captures a civilization beginning to lose the ability to distinguish between authentic experience and mediated performance because the distinction itself is collapsing historically. And Noh Varr embodies that collapse perfectly. He does not experience identity through older stable categories because he evolved beyond them culturally. His personality operates through fluid symbolic adaptation rather than fixed continuity. This is precisely why he feels simultaneously liberating and unsettling to modern audiences. He resembles the emerging 21st century self long before mainstream culture fully recognized what such a self would psychologically entail. Flexible identity, permanent performance, accelerated desire, fragmented affiliation, intermittent intimacy, hypervisibility combined with emotional detachment. Noh Varr moves through all of it effortlessly because he no longer expects coherent stability from either himself or civilization around him. That condition increasingly defines modern heroism itself, which is why the hidden connection to all-star Superman becomes culturally devastating. Superman belongs to a symbolic order where moral coherence remains psychologically imaginable. Noh Varr belongs to a symbolic order where coherence itself begins appearing artificial, performative, or historically obsolete. The transition between those two modes reflects a larger civilizational anxiety. Modern culture increasingly distrusts paternal authority, while simultaneously remaining psychologically desperate for stabilizing symbolic centers. This contradiction creates enormous tension inside contemporary myth-making. Audiences crave figures capable of imposing meaning onto fragmentation, yet instinctively suspect any claim to moral certainty as manipulative, authoritarian, or naive. The result is a culture producing heroes who no longer reassure. Instead, they mirror instability back at the audience. Noh Varr functions precisely this way. He fascinates because he survives the collapse of continuity without emotionally depending on its restoration. He does not promise healing. He promises adaptation. That distinction may explain why post-millennium audiences became increasingly drawn toward antiheroes, morally unstable protagonists, emotionally detached geniuses, and revolutionary figures operating outside traditional ethical systems. The heroic fantasy itself shifted. 20th century heroism largely revolved around protection. 21st century heroism increasingly revolves around navigation. The hero is no longer the guardian preserving civilization from collapse. The hero becomes the figure capable of psychologically surviving collapse while retaining some degree of agency inside accelerating systems. Noh Varr belongs entirely to this newer symbolic category, and Morrison frames that transition with obvious ambivalence. Because adaptation without emotional gravity creates terrifying consequences socially. Once civilizations stop believing in shared moral centers, symbolic polarization intensifies automatically. Groups no longer organize around stable collective narratives. They organize around amplification, identity performance, outrage circulation, aesthetic affiliation, and competitive visibility. Every faction begins perceiving itself as isolated tribe fighting for symbolic territory inside fragmented media environments. This is why the imagery of territory and invasion becomes so important throughout Marvel Boy. Cities stop functioning as communities and begin functioning as contested symbolic spaces. Corporations occupy territory psychologically rather than geographically. Media systems colonize attention itself. Even identity becomes territorialized through branding, aesthetics, ideological signaling, and performative affiliation. Civilization fragments into competing symbolic micro-empires, fighting for visibility and emotional dominance. Hexus externalizes this condition perfectly. The entity spreads not because it possesses superior military force, but because modern systems already operate according to its logic unconsciously. Expansion without limit, replication without reflection, consumption without emotional reciprocity. Hexus feels horrifying precisely because it resembles capitalism evolving into autonomous biological process. And Morrison intentionally blurs the line between villainy and environment. That is one of the comic's most important cultural insights. Modern systems no longer oppress populations exclusively through visible centralized authority. Control emerges through saturation, circulation, algorithmic amplification, economic dependency, and symbolic overstimulation. The individual no longer experiences domination as direct external force. Domination becomes atmospheric, which again reveals Superman's historical function more clearly in retrospect. Superman interrupted atmosphere. His existence imposed symbolic clarity onto increasingly fragmented environments. He reduced complexity emotionally. Audiences trusted Superman because his morality remained legible despite overwhelming power. He stabilized perception itself. Inside the symbolic ecosystem of superhero fiction, Superman represented the possibility that truth could still remain visible above noise. Marvel Boy imagines what happens after that visibility disappears. And culturally, that disappearance reshapes audience psychology profoundly. Modern audiences increasingly gravitate toward figures who embody contradiction rather than resolve it. Heroes become compelling precisely because they appear psychologically unstable, morally fragmented, emotionally inaccessible, or structurally incompatible with the world surrounding them. Contemporary culture often trusts damaged complexity more than coherent virtue because complexity feels more psychologically authentic to fragmented social conditions. Noh Varr anticipates that shift almost perfectly. He feels real to modern audiences not because he resembles ordinary humanity, but because he resembles the emotional disorientation produced by informational acceleration itself. He reflects a generation inheriting systems already experienced as compromised. A generation skeptical of institutions, yet psychologically formed by them completely. A generation simultaneously desperate for meaning and suspicious of anyone claiming to possess it, which may explain why Superman himself increasingly became difficult for mainstream culture to interpret sincerely. Not because audiences stopped admiring goodness, because audiences stopped believing goodness could survive power without hidden corruption beneath it. That suspicion transformed the symbolic landscape of heroism entirely. And Morrison appears deeply aware of the cost involved. Because despite all of Marvel Boy's revolutionary energy, the comic carries extraordinary underlying sadness. Not nostalgia exactly, something closer to mourning. The narrative constantly feels haunted by the absence of stable emotional gravity, even while insisting such gravity may no longer be historically sustainable. That haunting becomes especially visible in the contrast between Superman's relationship to humanity and Noh Varr's relationship to humanity. Clark Kent chooses emotional attachment as foundational principle. Noh Varr treats attachment as temporary condition fluctuating within larger adaptive processes. Superman sees humanity as moral community deserving protection before justification. Noh Varr evaluates humanity situationally, aesthetically, strategically, and the audience instinctively feels the difference. Even when Noh Varr behaves heroically, uncertainty remains suspended around him, because the emotional contract underpinning traditional heroism no longer feels secure. His power carries instability inherently. He may save humanity today, while remaining fundamentally unconvinced humanity deserves preservation tomorrow. That ambiguity reflects modern culture's relationship to power itself. Civilization increasingly admires disruptive intelligence while fearing its emotional detachment simultaneously. Technological innovation accelerates faster than ethical integration. Media systems reward visibility over coherence. Political systems fracture under polarization amplified by networked communication environments. Every structure continues expanding while collective psychological trust erodes underneath. And inside that landscape, Noh Varr begins resembling less a comic book character than a symbolic diagnosis. Not the next Superman. The kind of being civilization starts producing after losing faith in Superman's worldview altogether. The most unsettling aspect of Marvel Boy is that the comic no longer feels speculative. It feels descriptive, not literally in terms of technology or aesthetics, but psychologically. The world Morrison imagined has increasingly become recognizable. Institutions continue functioning while losing symbolic legitimacy. Media environments reward emotional escalation over coherence. Identity becomes fluid, performative, fragmented across networks and audiences. Corporations expand beyond national accountability into systems operating at planetary scale. Visibility itself mutates into currency. Attention becomes territory. Human beings increasingly experience themselves as interfaces moving through overlapping systems of stimulation, consumption, branding, and surveillance. And within that landscape, Superman begins feeling almost impossible. Not because people reject him emotionally. Quite the opposite. Superman remains culturally beloved precisely because he represents something modern civilization increasingly struggles to imagine as psychologically sustainable. Stable moral clarity, compassion without irony, power without narcissism, authority without domination, strength capable of remaining emotionally intimate instead of becoming abstract. Superman now resembles a memory of civilizational confidence, which transforms All-Star Superman into something even more melancholic in retrospect. The comic reads less like triumphant celebration and more like ceremonial farewell. Morrison writes Clark Kent almost as the final guardian of an emotional architecture already beginning to disappear historically. Every act of kindness inside the story feels impossibly fragile because the narrative quietly understands that future generations may inherit Superman's scale without inheriting Superman's emotional foundations. And then Marvel Boy arrives like the answer nobody wanted. Not evil Superman, something much more plausible. A post-human figure no longer emotionally organized around humanity as sacred center. That distinction explains why Noh Varr continues lingering in the imagination differently from most superhero reinventions. He does not feel like rebellion against Superman. He feels like evolution occurring after Superman's symbolic framework loses cultural dominance. Morrison never frames him as corrupted innocence. Noh Varr is not tragic fall from idealism. He is adaptation produced by historical conditions where older forms of idealism no longer stabilize reality effectively. And that makes him deeply unsettling, because the comic refuses to fully condemn him. Noh Varr often appears more psychologically honest than the civilization surrounding him. He recognizes systemic corruption immediately. He perceives media manipulation instinctively. He understands how power metabolizes identity, desire, and visibility into mechanisms of control. In many ways, he sees modernity more clearly than traditional heroes do. But clarity alone cannot replace emotional gravity. That becomes the central tragedy connecting these works invisibly across publishers and universes. Superman's greatness never emerged from superior intelligence or superior adaptation. It emerged from voluntary emotional attachment to vulnerable humanity despite possessing every reason to transcend it. Clark Kent continually chooses solidarity over superiority. Noh Varr rarely makes that choice. And Morrison seems profoundly uncertain whether future civilization will continue valuing such solidarity at all. That uncertainty extends far beyond superhero fiction itself. The transition from Superman toward Marvel Boy mirrors a broader transformation in how modern culture imagines leadership, success, identity, and survival. 20th century mythologies often revolved around integration. Strong individuals guiding fragmented societies back toward coherence. Contemporary mythologies increasingly revolve around navigation instead. Figures capable of surviving fragmentation without necessarily healing it. The difference is enormous. One model imagines civilization as improvable moral project. The other imagines civilization as unstable environment requiring constant adaptation. Noh Varr belongs entirely to the second world, which is why the comic's imagery continues feeling so culturally resonant. The collapsing boundaries, the saturation of media and consumption into biological existence, the replacement of stable identity with fluid symbolic performance, the erosion of institutional trust, the transformation of corporations into planetary structures detached from ordinary human scale. Morrison recognized that modern civilization was beginning to lose distinction between system and atmosphere. Hexus becomes the final symbolic expression of that realization, not because Hexus conquers the world, but because the world increasingly starts resembling Hexus already. Expansion detached from emotional reciprocity, consumption detached from meaning, replication detached from purpose. The entity survives because modern systems unconsciously reward its logic everywhere simultaneously. And standing against that environment is not Superman. It is Noh Varr. A figure equally shaped by acceleration, fragmentation, and post-human adaptation. The comic's deepest anxiety emerges precisely here. Morrison suggests that only beings psychologically transformed by the same historical conditions consuming civilization may remain capable of confronting those conditions effectively. But such beings may no longer love humanity the way Superman once did. That possibility changes the emotional meaning of superhero succession permanently, because succession traditionally implies inheritance of values. Sidekicks become heroes by internalizing moral continuity. Legacy heroes preserve symbolic stability across generations. But Marvel Boy imagines a succession defined not by continuity, but mutation. The next stage does not inherit Superman's worldview intact. It evolves beyond the emotional assumptions making that worldview possible. And once that process begins, return becomes impossible. This is why the comic continues haunting readers long after its narrative concludes. Not because it offers clean answers, but because it articulates a transformation modern culture still struggles to consciously acknowledge. The heroic imagination itself has changed. Audiences increasingly trust damaged complexity over coherent virtue, revolutionary disruption over paternal stability, adaptive intelligence over moral certainty, visibility over continuity. Noh Varr embodies all of it simultaneously. He is beautiful, unstable, emotionally intermittent, hyper-adaptive, culturally fluid, psychologically accelerated. He feels less like a traditional protagonist than a signal transmitted backward from a civilization already transformed by conditions the present still only partially recognizes. And perhaps that is the final hidden connection between these stories. All-Star Superman asks whether humanity can survive after the disappearance of the Solar Father. Marvel Boy answers by imagining the kind of consciousness humanity may produce while attempting to survive that absence. Not a monster, not a savior, something far more historically plausible. A successor civilization that inherited Superman's power, Superman's scale, Superman's evolutionary trajectory, but not necessarily Superman's faith in humanity itself. And Morrison leaves the audience suspended inside that realization deliberately. Because once the moral sun disappears from the center of civilization, history does not stop. It accelerates.